Lucas Bryant lived a life marked by quiet shadows. Years before he became the night guard at St. Mary's Clinic, he had worn a different uniform, a soldier's. Deployed during a humanitarian mission in Syria, Lucas had seen cities crumble under a sky of smoke and children weep into dust. His hands, once steady, had carried wounded civilians, rebuilt broken wells, and buried too many lost causes beneath a foreign sun. When his service ended, the battlefield faded into the horizon behind him, but its echoes followed with heavy footsteps that no distance could outrun. After returning home, Lucas became a man adrift. The medals he brought back from war gathered dust in a shoebox under his bed, while job applications and rental leases bore the marks of constant movement. Mechanic, night stalker, warehouse clerk, store janitor. Each town he lived in barely remembered his name by the time he disappeared into the next one. Stability seemed like a distant shore he could never swim to. What he needed most was a place where the world's noise would leave him alone. That place eventually became St. Mary's Clinic. The night shifts were long and mostly silent, the corridors empty but for the occasional shuffle of nurses or the muted beeping of heart monitors in the distance. Lucas found comfort in that emptiness. It was a rhythm he understood. Move quietly. Stay useful. Stay invisible. His life narrowed into simple routines: clock in at dusk, walk the perimeter, check the locks, nod politely at the exhausted nurses and janitors, clock out at dawn. Each task had a purpose, and each purpose kept the darker parts of his mind at bay. Lucas came to measure time by the feel of the building beneath his boots, the way the tile floor hummed beneath the janitor's buffer at midnight, the soft rattle of rain against the windows before dawn, the mechanical sighs of the hospital breathing in its sleep. Every night, before starting his rounds, Lucas would sit in a small break room by the security office. He would pour exactly 1 cup of black coffee into a battered metal thermos, its surface etched with scratches like battle scars. That thermos had followed him through Iraq, through Syria, through the long, shapeless years after. It was a small ritual, a moment of control in a life that had lost too much of it. Sometimes, during the lonelier stretches of night, Lucas found himself unconsciously touching the dog tag that hung beneath his shirt. The metal was cold against his skin even in the humid summer months, a reminder that no matter how far he traveled, some burden stayed chained to the heart. The tag bore only a name, Lucas W. Bryant, and a service number that few would recognize anymore. It wasn't for others. It was for himself. A quiet testament that he had once been part of something bigger, something that had mattered. Yet the man he had been then seemed almost like a ghost now. In the long hours before sunrise, memories would sometimes sneak past the walls he had built, the face of a young corporal he couldn't save, the sound of a mother screaming over the body of her child, the endless desert stretching out like an ocean of broken promises. He would close his eyes, take a slow breath, and push the images back into their dark corners. There was no space for them here. Not in this life. The people at St. Mary's knew Lucas only by what they saw, a quiet, polite man who never sought conversation and always remembered birthdays with a nod or a small wave. He was a fixture of the night, like the humming vending machines or the flickering overhead lights. Most assumed he preferred the solitude. Few guessed that it was necessity, not choice, that kept him distant. Lucas preferred it that way. Silence was safer. Silence didn't ask questions about why he flinched at sudden noises or why his hands sometimes trembled when the air grew too still. Silence didn't pity him. Silence let him survive. He had made a small life out of small mercies, a warm thermos, a good pair of boots, a quiet place to work. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Or so he told himself, night after night, pacing the halls like a silent sentinel. He had convinced himself that he needed nothing more, that the years ahead would simply unspool in quiet repetition. Nights blurred into weeks, weeks into months, each marked only by the slow wear of the soles of his boots and the gradual fading of his reflection in the polished glass of the hospital doors. Until the night he found Dr. Andrew Hayes collapsed against a cold, tiled wall. Until a long-buried past came rushing back, unbidden and unstoppable, the way a distant thunderstorm rolls toward a town that thought the skies would stay clear. Later that night, after the corridors had emptied of their few restless patients and the last shift nurse had nodded wearily at him in passing, Lucas found himself back in the small break room. A pale light buzzed overhead, casting weak halos against the yellowed walls. The vending machine in the corner hummed a low, mechanical lullaby. Lucas poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for Dr. Hayes, though the doctor hadn't asked for anything. They sat across from each other at the battered metal table, their postures stiff with a kind of shared weariness that didn't require words. Hayes cradled the paper cup in his hands, staring into the dark liquid as though it might contain answers. Lucas sipped from his own, the familiar bitterness grounding him. Minutes passed. Outside the narrow window, the city blinked and breathed, unaware of the quiet reckoning happening inside the clinic's walls. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice thin and rough. "She looked like someone I couldn't save," he said. Lucas didn't ask for details. He understood too well that sometimes the story didn't want to be dragged into the light. Sometimes it only needed acknowledgement, a place to breathe for a moment, before sinking back into silence. She was young. Barely 17, Hayes continued, his eyes unfocused. "Surgical error. I made the call. I thought I could fix it." Lucas felt the familiar ache behind his ribs, the one that came when watching a good man shoulder more weight than one's soul was built to carry. Hayes's fingers trembled around the cup. "She was smiling before we put her under. Said she wasn't afraid." The break room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing closer with the heaviness of unspoken regrets. Lucas set his cup down quietly. He thought of the faces he carried inside him, young men laughing in the desert sun, their futures burning away in a flash of metal and fire. He thought of the promises he had whispered to them, promises he couldn't keep. "I used to think," Lucas said, his voice low and steady, "that if I moved fast enough, if I worked hard enough, I could save them all." Hayes lifted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto Lucas's with a raw, hollow desperation. "But sometimes," Lucas continued, "saving them isn't in our hands." The truth hung there, heavy and unforgiving. A truth both men already knew, but needed someone else to say aloud. Hayes's shoulders slumped, as if a fraction of the burden had slipped from them. They sat in silence after that, sipping their coffee, letting the break room clock tick off the minutes. In that small space, grief was not something to be fixed or dismissed. It was something to be shared, like a heavy coat worn between them to ward off the cold. After a while, Hayes reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. He placed it gently on the table between them. It showed a young soldier, muddy and smiling, holding a medical pack under one arm. Behind him, a line of tents flapped in a harsh desert wind. Lucas's throat tightened. "That's Nathan," Hayes said, his voice breaking slightly. "Nathan Bryant." The name sliced through the haze like a blade. Lucas reached for the photograph with shaking hands. His brother's face stared back at him across the years, a face Lucas had not seen in more than a decade, yet knew better than his own. Nathan. His younger brother. His shadow during childhood, his comrade in uniform, his secret burden in every prayer he had whispered since the day Nathan died in Syria. Hayes watched him carefully, understanding flickering in his exhausted eyes. "I tried to save him," Hayes said. "God, I tried everything." Lucas said nothing. There were no words big enough to bridge the chasm opening inside him. Slowly, Hayes reached into another pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained envelope. "I've been carrying this for years," he said, sliding it across the table. "He made me promise to find you. But I couldn't." Lucas's fingers closed around the envelope. The paper was stiff and fragile, as though it might crumble at any moment. His name, written in Nathan's hurried, uneven scrawl, was barely legible through the dried blood. The room faded around him. For a moment, all he could hear was the wind howling through broken alleyways in a city half a world away. All he could feel was the weight of a promise long delayed, finally finding its way home. Hayes bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I failed him." "And you?" Lucas shook his head slowly. He understood, in a way that few could, that failure wasn't always about weakness. Sometimes it was just the cruel arithmetic of war, too much blood, not enough time. He tucked the envelope carefully into his jacket, a sacred trust restored to him after so many lost years. The two men sat quietly, the flickering overhead light casting long shadows on the floor. Outside the window, the city moved on, unaware that inside a small break room, two broken souls had found in each other the only thing that could make the weight bearable: understanding. Lucas finished his coffee, the bitter taste somehow sweeter now. Sometimes, he thought, healing didn't come with grand gestures or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it came quietly, like rain on dusty ground, soft, steady, persistent. And sometimes it began not with answers, but with the simple, powerful truth that no one was ever truly alone in their sorrow. In the following days, something invisible yet undeniable shifted between Lucas and Dr. Hayes. Where before they had moved past each other like distant stars in the same cold sky, now there was a tether, thin but strong, woven from shared loss and an unspoken promise not to let it be for nothing. Hayes began seeking Lucas out during the quiet moments between rounds, when the hospital sighed and settled into its nighttime breathing. Sometimes he brought 2 coffees. Sometimes he brought nothing but the heavy look of a man working through a lifetime of regret. Lucas never turned him away. Some wounds needed witness, not fixing. One evening, under the humming fluorescence of the staff corridor, Hayes caught up to Lucas just as he finished checking the last wing. "There's more you should know," Hayes said quietly. Lucas paused, sensing that whatever followed would not be easily put back into silence once spoken. They returned to the break room, its battered walls and stained floors a kind of confessional for 2 men who carried too much. Hayes placed a weathered journal on the table between them. Its cover was worn thin at the edges, the spine cracked from years of opening and closing. "I kept records," Hayes said, voice steady but distant. "Names, faces. Letters home that never made it. Messages they wanted someone to carry." Lucas's heart pounded. He knew without needing to open it that somewhere inside those pages were echoes of men he had fought alongside, laughed with, mourned. Hayes opened the journal carefully, turning the pages with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. He stopped at a folded sheet of paper tucked inside. Unfolding it slowly, he revealed a list written in tight, deliberate handwriting. At the top, in capital letters, was the date, Syria, 2010. Lucas's eyes scanned the list. Names he knew. Names that once lived, once mattered. Hayes pointed to one near the middle. Nathan Bryant. Status, Kia. Final words recorded. Lucas felt the world tilt slightly. Hayes pulled another item from his pocket, a slim, battered military dog tag strung on a black cord. Nathan's name was engraved across it, the metal dulled from time but the letters sharp as if they had just been struck. "He made me promise," Hayes said, "that if I made it home and he didn't, I would find you. Give you this. Tell you something he didn't get to say." Lucas reached out, fingers trembling as they closed over the dog tag. The metal was warm from Hayes's hand, and heavier than it should have been, as though it carried all the weight of years lost. Hayes hesitated, searching Lucas's face for permission. When Lucas gave a small nod, he continued. "Nathan said, to live for both of you. To be the life he couldn't have. He said you'd understand." Lucas closed his hand around the dog tag, squeezing until the edge bit into his palm. Tears welled unbidden in his eyes, blurring the grim little break room into soft shapes and muted colors. He had spent so many years burying the past, believing that survival was penance. That to live quietly, to demand nothing, was the only way to honor the dead. Yet here, handed back to him across time and blood and regret, was a different command, not just to survive, but to live. A tremor passed through him, like a dam cracking under the pressure of a rising tide. Hayes sat back, his own eyes damp. "I should have found you sooner," he said. "But I was ashamed. Afraid." Lucas shook his head. He understood better than anyone how guilt could become a cage. It wasn't about the delay. It was about the simple, stubborn truth that Hayes had come at all. In that moment, Lucas saw the man before him not as a failed doctor, not as a figure bowed by sorrow, but as a brother in arms, someone who had carried a piece of Nathan's memory through the wreckage of his own life, never letting it be forgotten. The two men sat for a long time, the silence between them no longer heavy, but sacred. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was rough but sure. "We still have time," he said, "to do something with it." Hayes looked up, hope flickering in his weary expression for the first time since that night in the hallway. Lucas placed Nathan's dog tag around his own neck, letting it rest beside his own. 2 names, 2 lives, side by side. A reminder that the story hadn't ended. It had simply found its next chapter. As the night deepened and the city outside softened into sleep, Lucas and Hayes made a quiet, unspoken agreement. The past would not be their anchor. It would be their compass. The night after the envelope and the dog tag had passed from hand to hand, the hospital felt different to Lucas. It wasn't that the fluorescent lights burned any softer, or that the creak of the old elevator sounded less strained. It was that for the first time in years, he was walking through the dark not to outrun the past, but to meet it where it waited. Around 2 in the morning, just as the cold seeped deepest into the building's bones, the call came over the radio. Security to emergency. Incoming trauma, possible veteran, uncooperative. Lucas tucked the radio back onto his belt and headed for the emergency wing. His boots echoed down the polished halls, the sound sharp against the hush. When he arrived, the ER was already buzzing. Nurses moved swiftly around a stretcher being wheeled through the sliding doors. On it lay a man, grimy, wild-eyed, bundled in an old military-issue jacket that clung to him like a second skin. The man thrashed weakly, shouting incoherent phrases half-formed from dreams and nightmares. Lucas heard fragments, commands in clipped military slang, cries for cover, and names called into empty air. The nurses exchanged worried glances. One of them, recognizing Lucas, called him over. "Maybe you can help," she said quietly. "He's terrified. Keeps calling for someone, says he's looking for Bryant." Lucas's heart jolted. He moved closer, careful not to loom or crowd. Up close, the man's face came into view beneath the grime and the beard, and Lucas staggered. It couldn't be. Tommy Greaves. He had been part of Lucas's unit in Syria, a young corporal with a crooked grin and a reckless courage that had made him both beloved and infuriating. Greaves had been declared missing in action after an ambush that left their convoy burning in the desert night. They had never found a body. Only ashes and twisted metal. But here he was. Alive. Broken, but breathing. Lucas knelt beside the gurney. "Tommy," he said softly, using the voice he hadn't heard come from himself in years, the voice of a brother in arms, not a night guard. Tommy's wild eyes found him, focused, and for a heartbeat, the panic receded. "Bryant," he croaked. "I'm here," Lucas said, gripping his hand tightly. "You're safe. You made it home." A shudder ran through Tommy's whole body, and he slumped back against the mattress, the fight draining out of him. Tears leaked from his closed eyes, carving clean tracks down cheeks stained with dirt and blood. The ER staff watched in stunned silence. Later, after Tommy had been stabilized and sedated, the attending physician explained what little they knew. He had been found wandering near the docks, malnourished and delusional. No ID, no possessions except the battered jacket and a torn photo of a platoon, Lucas's old unit, folded and refolded until the faces had blurred into ghostly smudges. Lucas sat beside Tommy's bed for hours, the chair uncomfortable and the clock indifferent. But he didn't move. He wasn't about to let another brother slip away into the cracks of a world too busy to notice. Hayes found him there just before sunrise, a cup of coffee in each hand. Without a word, he handed one to Lucas and sat down. The two men stared at the sleeping figure on the hospital bed, at the evidence that not all was lost, even when it seemed beyond hope. Lucas broke the silence first. He was supposed to be dead. Hayes nodded slowly. "We all were, at one point or another." Lucas stared into the coffee's dark surface, seeing not his own reflection, but the faces of the past returning one by one from the mist. Tommy's presence cracked something inside him wide open. The world he had sealed away, the world of loyalty, sacrifice, and unbearable loss, was still alive, breathing faintly beneath the dust and silence. He realized, sitting there, that life hadn't stopped the day he lost Nathan. Or the day he watched comrades vanish into smoke. It hadn't even stopped when he gave up on himself. Life had been waiting, patient and stubborn, for him to notice it again. And somehow, against all odds, it had brought him back a piece of what he thought he had lost forever. He looked over at Hayes, who sat with his head bowed, the coffee cooling in his hands. A different kind of thought took root, quiet, insistent. Maybe healing wasn't just something that happened to you. Maybe it was something you had to help build, one broken brick at a time, alongside others too battered to pretend they didn't need it. Lucas leaned back, exhaustion catching up with him at last, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. He didn't know yet how, or where, or even if he would succeed. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wasn't finished. Neither was Tommy. Neither was Hayes. And neither, somehow, was Nathan's memory. In the deep stillness of the hospital's early dawn, with the world outside still half dreaming, Lucas made a silent vow: he would live for all of them. Not out of guilt. Not out of duty. But because life still had stories to tell, and some of those stories needed him to stand up and be counted again. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary's Clinic changed in ways that few had seen coming. It started quietly, as most true things do. Lucas and Dr. Hayes spent long hours talking in the empty corners of the hospital, drafting an idea that at first seemed far too ambitious for two broken men to undertake. But the more they spoke of it, the more it grew into something real, something that carried the weight of every face they had lost and every promise they had left unfinished. A veteran support program. Not a government office, not another clipboard-filled bureaucracy, but a real place, right there inside St. Mary's, where soldiers and their families could come without fear or shame. A place for the forgotten to be seen again. Lucas hesitated when Hayes first suggested he lead it. He wasn't a doctor, or a counselor, or anything more than a man who had survived by accident more than design. He didn't think he had anything left to give. But Hayes had looked at him the way only someone who has carried the same burdens could, steady, certain. You don't have to fix them, he had said simply. You just have to show them they aren't invisible. And so Lucas agreed. It began with small things. A few pamphlets pinned to the bulletin board near the emergency entrance. A battered coffee pot always full, it sent greeting weary veterans who wandered in off the streets. A stack of used books donated from the staff lounge, offering stories to pass the long hours of waiting. Word spread quietly, in the way it always does among those who have learned to listen for things unsaid. Soon, Lucas found himself welcoming men with hollow eyes and women with worn hands, parents who had lost children overseas, children who had lost parents to wars they barely understood. Some stayed only minutes. Others returned again and again, lingering in the simple warmth of being recognized. Lucas no longer wore the stiff security uniform on those days. Instead, he wore plain clothes and the 2 dog tags around his neck, his own and Nathan's, resting together over his heart like a silent promise. He was no longer the ghost that walked the halls unnoticed. He was a living bridge between what had been lost and what could still be saved. Hayes, too, changed. His steps grew lighter. His voice, once brittle, grew steadier. Together, they navigated the slow, stubborn work of building something that could last beyond their own fragile healing. The hospital administration noticed. At first with suspicion, then with cautious support. Grants were applied for. Volunteers signed up. A local journalist wrote a small piece in the city paper about the Guardian at St. Mary's, a quiet man who had once only kept watch and now kept hope. On the walls of the small veteran center, framed photographs began to appear. Smiling faces, names once forgotten now honored. Some were of those who had walked through the door seeking help. Some were of those who never would again, but whose memories deserved better than silence. One afternoon, Lucas returned from his rounds to find a plaque mounted beside the center's entrance. It was simple. A polished brass square, etched with few words. In honor of those who carried more than their share. Dedicated by the patients and staff of St. Mary's Clinic. Below the inscription hung a small, unadorned coin embedded into the plaque, an old military challenge coin, battered and burnished by time. Lucas stood before it for a long time, the busy sounds of the hospital fading into a distant murmur. In the reflection of the polished surface, he saw himself, and behind him, as if standing guard in spirit, the blurred figures of those he had carried in his heart, Nathan, Tommy, Hayes, and 1,000 more whose names were stitched into the seams of his soul. He touched the dog tags at his neck, feeling their steady weight. The circle had not closed in grief. It had widened in hope. Later that night, sitting in the small break room where it had all beg *n, Lucas poured himself a cup of coffee into the same battered thermos he had carried across battlefields and lonely hospital corridors alike. The city beyond the hospital wall stretched and yawned into the night. Lucas leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence settle over him, not as a burden now, but as a companion. He had not saved everyone. But he had saved something. And in the end, that was enough. Because kindness without question was always enough.